Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Gardella. I'm the president of New Hampshire Public Radio, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us for Justice in Journalism. Justice in Journalism is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Warren Rudman Center here at the law school. And our mission at NHPR is to create a more informed public, and it's partnerships like this one that help us to do just that. Our guest this evening is NPR news correspondent Tom Gjelten. Tom covers issues of religion, faith, and belief for NPR News, a beat that encompasses such areas as the changing religious landscape in America, the formation of personal identity, the role of religion in politics, and social and cultural conflict arising from religious differences. His reporting draws on his many years covering national and international news, from posts in Washington and around the world. Tom joined NPR in 1982. And in 1986, he became one of NPR's pioneer foreign correspondents, posted first in Latin America, then in Central Europe. In the years that followed, he covered the first Gulf War, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, and the transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Tom will be joining us to read an excerpt from his newest book. It's called A Nation of Nations, A Great American Immigration Story. And after that, he will talk with Laura Knoy. As most of you know, Laura is the host of NHPR's The Exchange. On this year, she celebrates her 20th anniversary as The Exchange host. So tell your friends, if they're not here tonight, that Tom will be Laura's guest tomorrow morning on The Exchange for the full hour. So please help me and welcome Mr. Tom Gjelten.
Hello, everyone. Well, I have some bad news, or it's not bad news, but if you want to, I don't have a copy of my book, so so I can't. Oh, you do. Well, all right. I suppose I could read something from my book, but you know, I would encourage you to, if you're interested in my book, to buy it. You know, then. But no, I'll read something from the book if there's interest in that. Okay, well, so thanks. So thanks for coming. It's great to be here in New Hampshire. You know, I actually started my professional life in New Hampshire many years ago. After I graduated from college, I'd been working on a student newspaper at the University of Minnesota, and then I decided I wanted to become a school teacher. And I came to New Hampshire to be trained as a teacher. I went to the Antioch Graduate School, which some of you may know about. At that time, it was in Harrisville. I think it's in Keene now. So I spent 2 summers I lived in Dublin. And you know, after that, I moved to Maine, and I taught school in Maine for 6 years on the coast of Maine. And so I have, you know, sort of a whole kind of New England root period at the beginning of my professional life. And actually, I taught school on an island off the coast of Maine, a very isolated island. It was accessible only by ferry. We had a very small school and just a handful of teachers. And what we found teaching in that school is that there was really sort of very little understanding of what the special challenges of teaching in a geographically and culturally isolated rural community were. And I had studied anthropology in college, and I thought a lot about this sort of experience of being a teacher in an isolated community during the course of my teaching there. And I wrote a little book about it called Schooling in Isolated Communities, about sort of the role of the school in a rural community, and how important it was. And this was at the time of a lot of anti-consolidation battles, and that got me. I'm actually winding my way around to talking about NPR, but that actually could have moved me back into journalism. And I had a sort of a short and very interesting career as a freelance education writer, specializing in the problems of teaching in geographically and culturally isolated communities. And it was just a wonderful period. I spent time in Alaska. I spent time all over Appalachia in the rural United States. I went to Europe. I found that there was a lot of interest in the sort of the special problems of education in rural areas. And and while I was doing that, I moved to Washington, D.C., and an old friend of mine had started at NPR, and we shared an apartment, and this was John Idsty. Some of you may know him. I didn't know what NPR was, but I would come back from these reporting trips around the world or Alaska or elsewhere and have all these stories, and he said, you should take a tape recorder with you and, just do some interviews and I'll help you put together radio stories. And so I did that, and I just fell in love with the medium of radio. And so there was probably a year or two there where I was continuing to write, largely for professional audiences, about education. But at the same time, I was doing these freelance radio pieces based on my travels. The first piece I did was from rural Scotland, another one from Appalachia, parents organizing for schools there. I did a piece from Montana and one from Alaska. And then in 1982, NPR had an opening for an education reporter. And I was fortunate enough to be hired as the education reporter, education and labor reporter, but education was my first thing. So my career as an NPR reporter actually, can be traced to that first summer in New Hampshire and how it prepared for me. So it's great to be back. I've covered a lot of things since then, as Betsy said. And ended up being, after I came back from overseas, I was covering national security and foreign policy a lot. And you know what? It just got too difficult for me. It was unrelenting. I found that I was doing sort of the same stories, it seemed like, over and over again. I had the energy to continue working, but I was losing my kind of intellectual curiosity about the stories that I was covering, and I really felt I needed to do something different. For a long time, I'd wanted to turn my attention away from foreign stories and terrorism and war and pay more attention to America as a nation. This is actually an instinct, a feeling that I had when I first came back from overseas. They say that the best domestic correspondents are former foreign correspondents, because having spent a lot of time overseas, sort of figuring out new environments, getting to know new people and new cultures, you come back and you are able to look at your own country through fresh eyes. And I really wanted to do that. I had that same reaction. I was curious about sort of rediscovering America. And the problem was that NPR needed national security expertise, they needed foreign policy expertise, and so years and years and years went by when I was sort of stuck, as it were, covering stories that I was ready to move on beyond. But then finally, a couple of years ago, I decided I really wasn't going to do that anymore, and I got this opportunity to write a book about how America is changing sort of culturally, socially, as a result of immigration. And the specific angle of it was the upcoming 50th anniversary of the 1965 Immigration Act. And I had I'm not quite ready for that yet. I had a publisher who, Simon & Schuster, was very interested in this story to come out on the 50th anniversary. The 1965 Immigration Act was signed on October 3rd, 1965, so we've just had the 50th anniversary on it. The idea was to write a book about how America has changed as a result of the passage of this one law. And it's really a dramatic story. And to tell you the truth, when this publisher first suggested it to me, I couldn't have told you what the 1965 Immigration Act even meant or did. But it turned out to be really important. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides here in a minute. There is this myth in America, which you all know, that we are a nation of immigrants. And it goes back to the very beginnings of our country. George Washington said in 1783, the bosom of America is open to receive not only the respectable and opulent stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions. That was one of the sort of the founding statements of that myth. Nevertheless, when the U.S. Congress passed its first immigration law in 1792, it restricted citizenship to free white persons. So there's been this contrast from the very beginnings of American history between the ideal that we sort of had of this notion that we had about ourselves as a country that was open to everybody, a country that was a nation of opportunity where you could come and you could be defined as an American by what you did and what you believed without regard to your ancestry, your bloodline, and so forth. But it was a promise, it was a myth that was honored in its breach throughout most of American history. The title of my book, A Nation of Nations, comes from a Walt Whitman poem. The preface to Leaves of Grass that he wrote in 1855, in which he said, America is, in a sense, the greatest poem. It is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. But at the time, we, of course, did not allow African Americans to be citizens. And just a few years after the passage, after he wrote that, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded Chinese from coming to the United States. Towards the end of the 19th century, when global sort of movement was becoming more frequent and there was a lot more pressures to immigrate and people were starting to move to the United States in large numbers, an immigration restriction movement sprung up. And led by some very distinguished people, including people like Prescott Hall, who was professor at Harvard Law School. And he founded something called the Immigration Restriction League, in which he proposed that we limit our immigration in this country to people of basically Northern and Western European extraction, which was the peoples that basically had settled this country. And he said, do we want this country to be peopled by British, German, and Scandinavian stock, historically free, energetic, progressive, or by Slav, Latin, and Asiatic races, historically downtrodden, atavistic, and stagnant? This was written he wrote this at almost the same time as Emma Lazarus wrote the poem that is inscribed in the base of the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, your yearning to breathe free. So, as I say, throughout American history, we've had this contrast between these ideals that we tell ourselves we're about and the reality that we, in fact, have restricted immigration throughout most of our history. And the Immigration Restriction League, Prescott Hall and his people, were successful in convincing the U.S. Congress that we really did need to limit America to people who were most like us. So in 1924, we enacted national origin quotas that set aside immigration slots on the basis of your national origin. Just as an example, there were some 50,000 slots reserved each year for people from Germany, whereas each country in Africa, each country in Asia, and even the countries around the Mediterranean had only 100 slots apiece. And the idea was that we would sort of maintain this kind of Northern and Western European character to the country and keep to an absolute minimum Asians, Africans, Arabs, Middle Easterners, anyone who isn't from, even Italians and Greeks, were not entirely welcome. Well, in 1965, I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is somehow not the way it was supposed to be. only getting one slide. There we go. So in 1965, we passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, and it eliminated the national origin quotas that were a basis of our immigration law. For finally, all nationalities were to be treated the same way, on the same basis. And you can see from this chart here what happened as a result. This is the percentage of the US population that was born outside the United States. It reached its peak in 1910 and then was going down, 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 and then you see a major turning point. This coincides with the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act that opened America's doors to people from around the world, and suddenly it starts going back up again, a very sharp turning point. We're now almost back to the same place we were at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of the percentage of Americans born outside the country. But that's not even the most dramatic change as a result of this. I don't know why this is not, it was working before. I don't know, I could go to the next one. This is even more dramatic. This shows, of these immigrants who are coming to the United States, where are they coming from? Well, the blue lines represent Europe. The red lines represent everywhere else around the world. So the percentage of immigrants who have come to the United States from Europe, up there around 80, 90%, goes down, 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 and you see it crosses right about at the same point as that other chart. So now we have close to 90% of immigrants to the United States coming from outside Europe, and only about 10% coming from Europe, almost exactly the opposite of what it was in 1900. This is the result of the 1965 Immigration Act. For the first time, we not only opened our doors more widely, but we opened them to people who were not like us. And so in the last 50 years, we've had this dramatic change in the character of the US population. We now have people coming from all over the world, and this has produced a far more multicultural, diverse country than we've ever had before. Well, this is the story that I want to write about in my book. And what it has raised for me, and this was the question that interested me the most, is issues of national identity. What does it mean to be American? Now, when we have so many people coming from non-white, non-European backgrounds, what does the process of becoming American involve? What does Americanization mean? What is the notion of Americanness? Who are we as a nation? As I say, we've sort of thought that we had answers to all those questions before, but it was defined in a very different way because we really had not acculturated, assimilated, integrated people who were different. So, it was very important for me to approach this issue in a serious way because it is undeniable that things have changed in this country. We are no longer the country that we used to be. We are now a much more colorful, diverse country. So what does it mean to be American? And in this election season, we have, for the first time, really begun to debate these issues. And in fact, on the right end of the political spectrum, you have people like Ann Coulter, who are now saying the 1965 Immigration Act was a mistake because we allowed too many people who are not like us to come into the country. Well, Donald Trump does not talk about the 1965 Immigration Act, but he certainly talks about the influx of Mexicans and Muslims and people who are apparently different. So these are issues that have now, after 250 years, for the first time, we're really grappling with these issues. I wanted to deal with these in a serious way, which is to say, I wanted to sort of really raise the question of what does it mean to be American without presupposing any answers, but sort of exploring it through the lives of people that I found. And much of this book is set in a particular part of Northern Virginia, near where I live. Fairfax County. Fairfax County in 1970 was about 93% white and 7% black and 0.1% foreign born. Now, 1 out of 3 people in Fairfax County is born outside the United States. So this was a sort of a perfect place to explore what these issues of changing identity have meant. And as I say, I didn't want to sort of just tell another story about isn't America great and we incorporate all these people. I wanted to take seriously the challenges that this kind of transformation has meant for America. You know, Arthur Schlesinger wrote, "Mass migrations produce mass antagonisms." And that is the truth. I mean, this has not been an easy experience for our country to go through. Another historian that I quote, Otis Graham, said that the consequence, the danger of sort of opening your doors to immigrants of so many different backgrounds is that you will subject yourself to weakening social cohesion, mounting stress and ethno-racial division, and even regional separatism. So it's, you know, I did not mean to underestimate the challenge that we face as a country by opening doors to people whose cultural background and heritage and language and religion are very different. So in this book, I explore, for example, what it has been for a Muslim family to come to this country. And what has it meant for people whose language ability is, whose English-speaking ability is far less developed. And I sort of, this has been an opportunity for me to really, I think, sort of define my philosophy of journalism that I practiced, tried to practice all these years at NPR, which is to try to stay away from any kind of ideological judgments, but instead to sort of raise questions in a thoughtful, intelligent, and careful ways, to try and approach these questions in creative ways, without becoming, and in this case, without becoming either sort of a cheerleader for immigration or a nativist who is sort of criticizing immigration, but rather dealing sort of issue by issue with the special challenges that immigration has presented for our country. Now, I can get into that, and I can even read a little section of this book, but I don't want to take too much time. I wanted to sort of talk about how this philosophy of journalism has sort of guided me as an NPR reporter. I'm now covering, as Betsy said, I'm now covering issues of religion and belief. And when I started out as a religion reporter, my predecessor in that position, Barb Bradley, warned me that I was going to be inevitably stepping on toes, and I found that to be true almost immediately. I mean, people take their faiths really seriously, and they take their non-faith seriously. One of the first stories that I did was about atheism, and raised the question of whether, you know, atheism can be taken to such an extreme that it produces sort of intolerance, the same kind of intolerance that religious fundamentalists sometimes exhibit. And I was attacked by atheists for that. So I have run into opposition, you know, sort of every time around. But I sort of relish the idea of taking on these controversial stories and controversial themes and trying to present them in a careful, thoughtful, intelligent way. For me, fairness is the most important value in my journalism. I did a story recently about the concept of religious liberty, and those of you who are following this election campaign know that religious freedom or religious liberty is something that has been invoked a lot, particularly by, I think just about every Republican candidate now has a religious liberty advisory council. And the idea is that they're saying that Christians are under attack in this country, and that people are less free to exercise their faith than they used to be. And they, many of them like to quote from a 1960 Supreme Court decision in which, against school prayer, in which Justice Potter Stewart wrote that if the United States government limits the expression of prayer and Bible reading in schools, it's not actually exercising neutrality, but it is favoring the religion of secularism over other religions, that secularism is itself a religion, and for the U.S. government to take this kind of aggressively hands-off attitude, strict separation of church and state, that it's actually favoring the religion of secularism. So I took this on in a couple of stories, and I'm happy to say that the far-right people that I interviewed were thrilled that I raised this issue of whether secularism is itself a religion. And the secularists that I interviewed were thrilled that I actually dealt with their ideas in an honest way. So what I learned from that is even on some of the stories where you have very polarized and divided opinions, if you present sort of the argument, and Laura Knoy does this on her radio show here, so I'm not telling her anything she doesn't know, but if you present these issues in their complexity and with respect and sort of approach them in thoughtful ways, there is no reason why you as a journalist cannot satisfy all sides. I mean, I still really strongly believe in, as I say, the idea of fairness and objectivity and intelligence. I think that what characterizes NPR as a news organization is our smartness. Not our ideology, and people are going to be able to look at individual stories and people we interview and sort of identify, some kind of favoritism perhaps. But I think the most important thing that characterizes NPR as a news organization is our intelligence and our willingness to talk. And this goes for member stations, it goes for talk shows all over the network, it goes for our news programs, but our willingness to talk about issues in a really thorough, thoughtful, intelligent way without giving way to cliches and demagoguery and so forth. And now as the religion and belief correspondent, I'm really having this opportunity over and over again. I mean, I'm taking on subjects that are extremely controversial. I mean, right now, as the religion reporter, just to give you one example, there was a poll that came out recently that showed that 84% of Americans acknowledge that they know little or nothing about Islam. And this is at a time when Muslims and Islam are very much at the forefront of our national conversation. And so as the religion reporter, when I look at something like that and find that 8 out of 10 or more than 8 out of 10 Americans know nothing about Islam, and yet it's dominating the conversation, that to me is that sets my agenda as the religion reporter. Obviously I need to educate my listeners about what Islam is all about, what it's like to be Muslims, what Muslims are going through. So that's the kind of way that I sort of choose stories and decide where I want to go. I can talk about some of the other stories I'm working on, and we'll have a conversation here in a minute. But I think in general, what I like to do in my reporting is take on the most controversial issues of identity right now in our country. It's what I did in my book. It's what I'm doing in this current beat. And I really want to show, and I'm determined to show, that these issues can be discussed in a way that leaves everyone feeling that they have been treated respectfully and thoughtfully and fairly. And that is my goal as a journalist. That is, I think, what we're about at NPR. I'm going to leave it there for now. We have some time here, and I can read something from my book if you really want to. But we're now going to sort of turn this into more of a conversation involving you. But first, before we do that, I'm going to bring Laura Knoy up here. And Laura and I are going to chat again about some of these issues. Thank you very much, and we'll just continue this conversation. Here's Laura Knoy.
Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I did want to remind you that we would like to take as many of your questions as possible, and it's great to see such a good turnout tonight. Wow, on a cold January night. Faith Meixel, my wonderful producer, will be collecting your questions. So if you have a question for Tom that you want to scratch down on a card now, just hold your hand up. And if you've already written a question and you want to just make sure Faith gets it, just sort of subtly hold it up. You don't want to wave it over your head, but and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So please feel free. As you heard from Tom, he's got a long career in all sorts of fascinating pockets of the world. So any questions are welcome. And Tom, thank you for coming.
It's great to be here, Laura.
I had no idea that you
Laura
got
and I
your
go
start
way
in New
back, by
Hampshire.
the way.
We do. I was chained to the newscast desk, and Tom was roving the world. So, and thanks for coming during this primary season. It's good to get your thoughts, especially on some of the issues that we're hearing about in the news. And again, bring your questions to us, and we'll try to get to them. I also want to let everybody know Tom will be on the exchange with us tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to focus more on his book, which is wonderful. I just finished reading it this afternoon. So we'll focus on that tomorrow. Please listen to that show, as you all know, live at 9 and again at 8 p.m. and, of course, anytime at NHPR.org. So, Tom, while we're waiting for questions to come in, a couple questions related to your presentation just now. And then I did want to ask you about your experiences in Yugoslavia, in Cuba, in Central America, at the Pentagon. But a couple things from what you just said now. You said the best domestic correspondents are former foreign correspondents because you see your country with fresh eyes. What did your fresh eyes see, Tom, upon your return to the United States in the mid-90s?
What a great way. Well, I returned to the United States in 1994, fresh from Sarajevo. And in fact, I was living in Berlin at the time. I lived in Berlin from 1990 to 1994. From July of 1992 until February of 1994, I didn't file a single story from Germany. I spent that entire time in Sarajevo. I'd come back to Berlin about every 6 or 7 weeks to get more cash and wash my clothes and pay my bills, and then I'd go back to Sarajevo. That was an incredibly important time for me as a person, for me as a journalist, because I was there as this country fell apart, and I saw the power of ethnic nationalism, which was terrifying, and the notion that people who were, I'd covered wars before, but I have to say that, and understand what I'm saying here, when you're in a war, covering a war that basically involves a peasant population in Central America, or a population in the Gulf, there's a kind of a sense that they're not like me, they're different than me. When I went to Sarajevo, what struck me more than anything else is they were people just like me. I mean, they had read the same books, they had the same education, they were European, they were white, they thought like me, and yet they were being consumed and being killed in this sort of orgy of ethnic nationalism, and they were subject to the demagogic arguments of politicians who were separating people, each from the other. And I came back here, and I was just blown away by, I had forgotten, I guess, how diverse America was. And I was blown away by the accommodations that we have in this country, the institutions we have developed, the habits we have developed, the successful ways that we have actually, over time, really matured as a nation. And that was really to me, it really set us apart from Europe. Europe, we're Europeans, but I had seen this in Germany. I'd seen the way they treated Turks in Germany, and I just had this experience in Sarajevo. And I guess that's the first time I really wanted to focus on issues of national identity, because the contrast between the life that we have in the United States and the ways that we manage diversity in this country versus what I had just seen in Europe was the number one thing that struck me.
Wow, and that's really laying the groundwork for this book. I mean, even though it was back in the 90s.
I've been thinking about these issues ever since.
Wow. Well, another question from your presentation just now, and then I do want to ask you more about Sarajevo, because that's really interesting. You said that changes in Fairfax County have been huge and rapid, and that, it's been challenging. It has not been easy.
No.
What has not been easy? I mean, I just finished the book. You don't sugarcoat this thing.
Some people think I sugarcoated it too much, Laura. And I guess that there was a message in there that I sort of wanted to emphasize America's resilience, because that's the point that I sort of wanted to come to in the end. And maybe I'm really glad that you feel that I didn't sugarcoat it, because that is something that I wanted to avoid. You know, it's really hard. I mean, to leave your country, your homeland, I mean, each of us can imagine what it would be like to leave America and to start all over again in another country. I mean, the stresses that this brings about. One of the biggest problems that immigrant families encounter is they don't come as a single family. They often come sort of one by one or two by two. And so you get issues of family separation. Sometimes parents will come and they can't afford to bring their kids, and their kids stay back with their grandparents or with aunts and uncles, and then only later join their parents. I mean, this is a very typical experience in immigration. And what you get is these incredible stresses within families and conflicts, and kids who have been accustomed to living alone are all of a sudden rejoined with their parents, and their acculturation experiences are really different. The economic dislocation that takes place when people come to this country and they find out it's much more expensive than they ever expected it would be, and they have to move in with friends. I tell a story in the book of a couple from Bolivia who had 2 kids, and they moved in with another couple who also had 2 kids. This is in a 1-bedroom apartment. And, they sort of like hung curtains across the living room, and they ate on TV trays. I mean, the difficulties of adjusting to life in another country are overwhelming. And the truth is that some people don't make it. It's not that it's, we have this kind of part of the myth is that you come here and then like you end up like succeeding beyond your wildest dreams. Not everyone does succeed. Some people get trapped in kind of an underclass, and it may take a generation or 2 to move beyond it. So, and the issues of religion that continue to divide us. And I purposely chose a Muslim family to write about because, there probably is no single immigrant population whose profile sort of is separate from kind of the all-American profile more than Muslims. So, no, I really didn't mean to sugarcoat these.
No, and you don't. And the other thing you don't sugarcoat is the adjustment of the communities. Again, in this instance,
Right.
Fairfax County,
Right.
you write about, it's been hard for police, law
Right.
enforcement, they're trying to figure out how to deal with all these different groups. African Americans in Fairfax County were, in some instances, not happy. They felt
No.
like they were being displaced by
They
new
worked for
immigrants.
years and years to
So-
get what they got, and all of a sudden they had to share it.
So there's a lot of that
Right.
in there, some of those
100
challenges.
Fairfax County schools, students speak 100 different languages.
That's another element
So
that
if
you
you're a
bring up.
school administrator or a teacher, how do you deal with that? You can't find translators you can't do ESL, where English is a second language instruction, where you have speakers of 100 languages. You just can't do it.
Well, I'll hold off on some
Yeah.
more questions on the book for
Okay.
a moment. We have some terrific questions already from our audience, so I'll go to those. And here's one related to our conversation just a minute ago, Tom, about Sarajevo. What do you think makes the U.S. different from Bosnia, for example, in its ability to avoid those types of divisions? It's a great question.
It's a great question, and I think there's a very clear answer to it, which is that it's a democracy. The reason that Yugoslavia fell apart was because Yugoslavia was a communist country, and it did all right for the first 40 years after the Second World War, largely because, just to take a little aside into history here, it was led by a man, Marshal Tito, who was not aligned with either the Soviet Union or with China, and therefore the United States and other countries wanted to support Tito because it was sort of an inroad into the communist world that did not align with either the Soviet Union or with Red China. So we showered Yugoslavia with loans, with credits, bank credits, favorable trade terms, and we propped up that country. It was a communist socialist country whose economy was dysfunctional, but it was propped up for 40 years by the largesse of the West who sort of wanted to support Tito. Well, what happened is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we didn't need Tito anymore. We didn't need an independent Yugoslavia because we were getting democracy across the whole Eastern Bloc. So all of a sudden there was a cutoff of all that aid to the former Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia's economy went into a tailspin. Factories were closing, unemployment went through the roof, and you had this former communist leader, Slobodan Milosevic, who very smartly recognized that he needed a new ideology to stay in power because socialism wasn't going to do it anymore, communism wasn't going to do it anymore, he had lost the support of the West, so he turned to ethnic nationalism and convinced the Serbs that the Croats were the source of their problem. You had in Croatia, you had Franjo Tudjman, who convinced the Croats that Serbs were their problem. Scapegoating was taken to new heights, and nationalism took root. And it really hadn't been a problem for 40 years. In America, we have democratic institutions that have sort of allowed us to deal with diversity over the years and social challenges and cultural conflict. If you do not have democratic institutions, you are vulnerable to leaders who will do exactly that.
Wow, and those names you read, I remember reading those names on the newscasts in the mid-90s, and boy, that's bringing a lot of memories back. And Tom, it's so easy to look back at that war in hindsight and point to all these mistakes and events, and I wonder, with your hindsight, were there actions, looking back now, that the world, the U.S., smart diplomatic people, the UN, could have taken so that it would not have either have been prevented or just not have been so long and bloody and terrible?
I think that in the end, it actually took outside military intervention to end that war. I mean, that's the sad truth of it. We weren't going anywhere, and it didn't stop until there was an outside military intervention. What I found during that war is that, covering that war, one of the lessons I learned is that war is a self-perpetuating, you get into a self-perpetuating cycle because you get victims and aggressors, and the victims then are victimized and they react aggressively. And so you get in this kind of constant cycle of retribution and vengeance, and it's really, really hard to escape from that. On the other hand, peace is itself also a kind of a repeating cycle, because in the absence of fighting, trading links get established, people start doing business with each other, borders break down, you get to know each other. The more you trade with each other within a country, the more economic, commercial, business links get established, sort of conflict gets resolved. So whether it's war or peace, you actually can kind of get into these self-perpetuating cycles. And what was so important in the case of Yugoslavia is you had to break that cycle. You had to break that fighting cycle. And the parties could not, did not, would not do it themselves. It took outside intervention. The biggest problem is that it came so late in the game. It came only after horrible massacres had taken place, only after 150,000 people, a third of whom were civilians, were killed. And I wish that it had. I wished at the time that it could have come much earlier. I'm going to be guest hosting the Diane Rehm Show, which is something that Laura has done as well. And I'm going to be interviewing the author, an old friend of mine, who wrote a book about the war crimes tribunals in the former Yugoslavia and the hunt for war criminals. And some of us feel that in a way the establishment of these war crime tribunals was an admission of failure, because rather than prevent the war crimes from taking place, we let them take place, and then we prosecute the criminals. Wouldn't it have been better to just prevent them from taking place in the first place? That's one of the questions that I'm going to raise. So.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to hearing that interview, and I could ask you 6 more questions about Sarajevo. It's fascinating and tragic. I did want to ask you about another book that you wrote, and remind everybody, Tom did write a book about Yugoslavia called Sarajevo Daily, A City and Its Newspaper Under Siege. So there's a plug for that one. I want to ask you about another book, though, and this is fascinating. Tom and I were talking about this just before we came out tonight, a book about Cuba called Bacardi, and the Long Fight for Cuba, the biography, thank you. I can't read my own handwriting. The biography of a cause. How did rum play into the fight for Cuba?
No, rum didn't really play any role in the fight for Cuba. Although there is a kind of a connection, but it's pretty tenuous. And that rum is a product made in Cuba, and it's a sort of a national symbol of Cuba. But
right.
no, the story is that the Bacardi family is a Cuban family, and they produce rum, which is this quintessentially Cuban product. And they were the largest wholly Cuban-owned company in Cuba. They were formed in the middle of the 19th century, and there was a kind of a Cuban patriotism that was embodied in the Bacardi family. I mean, the Bacardi sons and daughters were socially and politically progressive. The son of the founder was one of the leaders of Cuba's fight for independence. And with each generation of Bacardi family history, there was some connection to Cuba's fight for dignity and sovereignty and freedom. You know, in the beginning it was fighting against Spanish colonial rule. And once Cuba achieved its independence, the United States came in and occupied Cuba for 5 years. I don't know if you know that Cuba was under a U.S. military occupation for 5 years, and the Bacardi family during that period was very anti-American and fighting for Cuba's sovereignty and to escape from U.S. Suffocation. And then the United States sort of pulled out, but then Cuba had a dictator, Gerardo Machado, who was a horrible man, and the Bacardis were fighting him. And then we had Batista, and the Bacardis were fighting Batista, and they were supportive of Fidel Castro's revolution. They were sort of Fidel's favorite company because while a lot of other companies fled Cuba, they stayed and they supported the revolution. And then one day in October 1962, 1960, their own properties were confiscated by Fidel, and they went into exile. And in exile, they felt that they had been betrayed by Fidel because they had been big supporters of Fidel. So in exile, they become Fidel's worst enemies. So the biography of a cause, the cause is this fight for Cuba's freedom over 150 years against all these adversaries. And what I found was that the Bacardi family had been involved sort of personally in every single stage of that fight. And that's why I call it the biography of a cause. The cause is the fight for Cuba's freedom, and I tell the story by weaving it through the Bacardi family history.
That's fascinating. Have you been back to Cuba? Things are opening up there.
Things are opening up, to my great delight. Unfortunately, I have not been able to see it because my book was published in September 2008, and even though I would say that 95% of my book, the Bacardi book, is very favorable to the Cuban government's own interpretation of its history, that last 5% is not, and that's all it took. So they made it clear I was not welcome to go back, and I haven't been able to go back since. I'm hoping things change enough that I will be able to go back. I was officially told I couldn't come back. I've not asked permission to go back again recently, and I have had some conversations. It turns out that my book is actually in Cuba and is quite widely read in Cuba, but I haven't been able to go back.
Try and get booked on the Cuban version of the Diane Rehm Show, and
I
maybe
don't know
they'll have
there's no such thing. There's no such thing. The exchange and the Diane Rehm Show don't exist in Cuba.
Well, here's another question from our audience, and this relates to our earlier conversation about religion in America, your efforts to highlight a Muslim family in your book, Tom. Why are Muslims so much more separate from the mainstream than other minority/immigrant groups? And thank you to the person who asked this question.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that that is true. And it's because the truth is that while we are not officially a Christian nation or a Judeo-Christian nation, sort of the truth is we are a Judeo-Christian nation. And that sort of has been the kind of heritage of the country. And so Muslims have found themselves kind of marginalized in this country and found that they haven't quite fit in. many observant, pious Muslim women cover their heads, and therefore they stand out physically. And so it's just been, and there's been sort of anti-Muslim prejudice in this country. I think that when immigrant populations or minority groups feel somewhat marginalized, there's often a tendency for them to retreat into their own world. And so I think some of this kind of separation is of Muslims' own making. I'm actually working on a story right now for NPR about what American Muslims right now are talking about privately, not in terms of their outreach, but how American Muslims are debating right now how separate they should be or how engaged they should be and what makes most sense for them. There's a lot of debate within the American Muslim community right now about what their position should be with respect to the rest of society, and maybe the beginning of a sense that they've been too isolated and that they need to sort of find more opportunities to engage, more opportunities to be involved, and to be a little bit more open about who they are and what their religion is all about.
You write about young people, high schoolers, teenagers, young adults in Fairfax County, and you seem to say, Tom, in the book that it's especially hard for young Muslim women to have that integration, to become more a part of what this person calls mainstream society.
Right. Well, that's true. I mean, it's true. A Muslim man can marry a non-Muslim woman, and she can convert to Islam, and everything's fine. There's no rules that have been broken. That happens. A Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim man and sort of have the same experience. If a Muslim woman were to marry a non-Muslim man, she'd basically be estranged from her community. So there's more pressure on them. There's obviously the issue of the hijab, the headscarf. There's a lot of, there's a lot of pressures on Muslim women that Muslim men don't experience. I think it's very important to write about these issues with sensitivity, because it's not true by any means that Muslim women are necessarily oppressed. I mean, we shouldn't jump to conclusions. There's a big debate right now about whether Muslim women who wear headscarves are sort of acknowledging that they are oppressed, or that this headscarf is in some way a symbol of oppression. Because I have met many, many brilliant, free-thinking Muslim women who wear hijabs, headscarves, and they do it out of pride in their heritage and devotion and piety. And they can be PhDs. The wife of one of the characters is a PhD molecular biologist. His two daughters are going to Harvard and Yale. I mean, these are not women who are not empowered. These are not women who are oppressed, and yet they choose to be pious and devout. But they certainly have different issues to deal with than other women do.
What did you hear from the Muslims that you interviewed, Tom, for the book about how they felt after 9/11? By the way, you were at the Pentagon on 9/11, just doing your job. So maybe you can tell us that story too.
I was actually reporting on the air. I was on the air the moment the plane hit the Pentagon. And I had a TV set in my booth, and it was CNN, and it was a live picture of the White House. And I'm talking to Bob Edwards, this morning edition. And as I'm talking to him, I see this column of smoke rising behind the White House. And so we're speculating on the air, what could that smoke be from? It's a big column of black smoke. And I have no idea. I mean, I'm on the complete opposite side of the building from where the plane hit, and I'm in the radio area, and all the radio booths are soundproofed with, acoustic proofing, and the door is closed, so I have no sense that anything has happened. And then the wire stories start to come in, and Bob Edwards says to me, and this is archived on tape, Tom, we have a report here that the Pentagon has been hit. What can you tell us about that? And I said, no, Bob, that can't be true. I'm here. I'm here. I don't feel a thing. Everything is normal. there must be some mistake. The Pentagon has not been hit. And no sooner had I said that than my door blew open, and the guy in the SWAT team, with a gun drawn, came in and like grabbed me and yanked me out of there. And so that was it. So then I was off the air for about 45 minutes until I could find a phone. But I was interrupted live on the air, when I found out that, in fact, the Pentagon had been hit. But I have to say, I had no idea that anything had happened.
Yeah, that's quite a story. Where's that smoke coming from? Oh,
Yeah.
the other end of the building.
Right.
And it is a big building. And not to go on too much on 9/11, but you do say in the book that after 9/11, it was tough for the Muslims in Fairfax County.
Oh, yeah, right.
The FBI was checking people out. Local police were checking
Right.
people out. Give
Right.
us just a taste of what it was like for
Well,
some of those folks.
for in the beginning, the first reaction, and I was, of course, covering these issues, in terms of national security at the time, the first reaction was, will there be another attack? Is this the, we knew of 18 people that had been involved in this one, or 19, and, are there more? Is this just the beginning of something? Where did these guys come from? Who were their co-conspirators? And so that, for weeks and months afterward, that was the big issue. What's the next shoe going to be? When's the next attack coming? Who did these guys know? And the truth is that several of them came from Northern Virginia, and 2 of them had worshipped at Dar al-Hijra Mosque, which is a mosque I write about in the book that's right there in Fairfax County. So there were Fairfax County connections to the 9/11 hijackers that basically they had to be explored one at a time. I write about a police officer who went from being a very community relations oriented police officer to being basically a counterterrorism investigator overnight. And she told me that in those first few weeks after 9/11, they were getting 200 terrorism reports per month, 200 leads that had to be investigated. So the entire thrust of law enforcement in Northern Virginia was squarely on counterterrorism. And, big sweeps, surveillance, all this kind of stuff. So, American Muslims are caught right in the middle of that. And it was a terrible, terrifying experience, and they were frightened themselves. And, all of a sudden, suspicion was focused on them. It was a terrible time to be a Muslim.
Another question from our audience who says, looking at religion, do you think America is more or less enthralled and excited about learning about the other?
Enthralled or excited versus...
Is more or less enthralled or excited? I guess you could rephrase it by saying, how enthralled do you see America as learning about the other?
That's what I'm dedicated to.
Yeah.
That's what I'm dedicated to, and that's what this book is about, and that's what my current reporting is all about. I'm really focusing on the other, and everybody's other is different. We all have our own others. I don't find that. I think that, there is, on the one hand, there is an instinctive fear of the other and mistrust. My experience, whether it's overseas or in this country, is that politicians manipulate those fears and prejudices. It's so easy, and I talked about the extreme example of former Yugoslavia, where you had entire ethnic groups serving as scapegoats for a failed system. You've seen this throughout history. I actually think that America, we are more, I'm convinced of this, we are more trusting of the other than most people are around the world, and yet, we have to deal with that as well. I think that, ask me at the end of this year. We're right now in a primary season where the polarization in this country seems to come out in its most aggressive way every 4 years, because you have politicians who actually have an interest in preaching to one group or another, and then we sort of drift back, together again. And you often see a big change between the primary phase of an election campaign and the general election, when people sort of come back in the center. So right now it seems like those passions are really paramount. But what do you think? Maybe in 9 months, it's going to be a whole different story.
Well, here's another question that relates to both your current beat on religion and faith and your past experience as a foreign correspondent. I like this question. Do you think the Muslim Sunni-Shia divide is mainly religious or practical?
Well, it's political. It coincides with geopolitical rivalries in the Middle East, between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Iran and Iran's allies. There are theological differences between Sunni and Shia Islam, and this is something that I'm exploring a little bit, but they're really pretty minor. One significant difference is that Sunni Islam is a little bit more this worldly oriented, and therefore Sunni Muslims are more interested in sort of issues of society and politics, whereas Shia Muslims tend to be a little bit more otherworldly oriented, and therefore there's a lot of interest in martyrdom and sort of preparing for the hereafter. But over 1,000 years, these issues have been resolved, and the reason they're so much in conflict right now is because there is these intense rivalries that are totally the product of 20th century realignments and national struggles and competition over oil, and other things that have really taken what is a fairly minor theological difference and really enlarged it. If you see it in this country, you have Iraqis living in this country who are Sunni and Iraqis who are Shia, and they, in many cases, will worship together. Although, it was funny, I was having this conversation. You talk to a Sunni and they say, there's no such thing as a Sunni mosque. Our mosques are open to everybody. So Shia can pray with us. But we're not welcome in the Shia mosques. And you talk to a Shia and they say, our mosques are open to everybody. We let Sunnis pray with us, but we're not welcome in a Sunni mosque. So they have this notion, among themselves that they're open to everybody. The truth is that the tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslims in this country are pretty minor, and where they get enlarged is, in geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's definitely an issue to explore in this new beat, and I think we
Yeah,
all get a
it's
sense
on
of your
my list,
excitement
yeah.
about this, and that's great. What else do you think in this new beat that you're on, Tom, needs to be explored more? What are we not thinking about enough when it comes to religion and faith?
Well, I mentioned, and this is really at the top of my agenda right now because of what's going on in politics. I really feel that Americans need to be much more educated about Islam, and that is my number one priority right now as a reporter. I'm also I also sort of feel that we need to be, this sounds so cliched, but we need to sort of learn to be more respectful of each other. And the truth is, and I think you know this, Laura, the NPR audience tends to be probably more liberal than the regular population and probably a little more secular. And so I have a mission as the religion reporter to sort of take that segment of the population and those worldviews that are probably most at odds with my NPR audience and try to present them in such a way that we can understand where people are coming from, and have more respect for, conservative evangelicals that maybe, the NPR listener would have. And conversely, in speaking to conservative evangelical groups, I want to sort of emphasize that, you may feel that you are being marginalized, but the truth is that there are parts of the country where if you're not an evangelical Christian, you're feeling marginalized. I interviewed a professor, a secularist professor, who talked to doing field work in the Deep South, where he said that, if kids announced at school that they weren't going to church, they could be bullied on the playground and things like that. Everybody can be subject to prejudice. Prejudices work in every direction. So, I sort of have this feeling like, depending on which audience I'm talking to, I'm always trying to sort of present kind of a devil's advocate sort of position and get people to rethink their preconceptions and their prejudices. And so in covering religion and belief is the ideal beat to sort of get people to challenge their preconceptions.
Do you have a religious background that you bring to this beat?
I do. I do. I was raised as a Norwegian Lutheran, and in a very sort of conservative upbringing. And I went to Sunday school every Sunday, and I can quote the Bible, and it helps me, because when I'm talking to evangelical Christians, I know the Scripture, and I can refer to it, and I can cite it. On the other hand, don't think that I could do this job as well as I think I can do it if I were as devout as I once was, because one of the things about religion is that you become absolutely convinced that you have all the answers. And for someone who has to cover Islam, Hinduism, secularism, atheism, I've got to sort of have a little bit more of a openness to all belief systems and all faith traditions. And it might actually be harder if I was still as devout as I once was.
So all those Sunday mornings when you didn't want to go. Thanks,
Right.
Mom. It paid off,
Well,
right?
more or less. I mean, my parents sent me to a very conservative Lutheran college, and after a year and a half, I said, I can't take this anymore. So I left, and I was just yearning for worldliness. I wanted to go. I started out in a little Norwegian Lutheran college in northern Minnesota where everybody was exactly like me, and had exactly the same upbringing. And I wanted to go to a university where, a much more cosmopolitan environment where I'd meet people of all different backgrounds and sort of be exposed to all different kinds of ideas. And I really had to escape from that insulated environment. It was okay for a while, but I had to rebel.
Yeah. Well, in the book, Tom talks about his Norwegian ancestors, and
Yeah.
that's really fun, their immigration story. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Here's another question that I did want to ask you, Tom. Getting back to your time as a war correspondent, journalists seem to be at greater risk these days. How do you balance covering the story and your personal safety? It's a great question, especially given your time in Sarajevo.
Well, I was talking about this with Laura before we came out here. When I was in Sarajevo in 1991, 92, 93, 94, the city was being constantly shelled. There were probably 100 civilians dying a week, just walking the streets and shot by snipers, and the shells would come just randomly. You never knew. You didn't know if you're out. You didn't know if you should run or if you should walk especially slowly, because if you ran, you could run into something, and if you walked too slowly, something could come from behind. And you didn't know, you never knew when anything was going to hit. And it was a very bloody time, and I had close friends who were killed and injured in Sarajevo. But this was a new experience. I mean, we had never encountered a war like this before. I'd covered the wars in Central America. You knew where the front lines were. You'd get up in the morning, you lived in a hotel, you would drive out to one particular front, and you'd be with one side or you'd be with the other side. Maybe, I'd go out with the Salvadoran army, or I'd go out in a helicopter on a combat mission with the Salvadoran army. I knew exactly where I was, what I was doing. Then I'd go around to the other side and come in with the guerrillas, and so there were front lines. You knew where you were, and actually not that many reporters got injured. There were a few, but not nearly as many as were killed or injured in Bosnia. So we had no experience with a war like this before, and we didn't know how to train for it. We didn't know how to prepare for it. I remember calling up my NPR editors and said, you know what? I need a bulletproof vest. And they said, where could you get one? And I had no idea. And the first bulletproof vest that I bought on the black market in Belgrade. And it was one of these, the kind of vests that police officers wear under their shirt? It was one of those, which is an anti-ballistic vest, but it is absolutely useless against a high-powered rifle. I mean, the high-powered rifle round will go right through it. They're made for small rounds because they're made for police officers. It's the only one I could find, and I paid hundreds of dollars for this. because it was the only thing I could find. And it gave me a little bit of a sense of security. But NPR was of no use whatsoever. I mean, they approved the expense and they reimbursed me for it, but they had no idea what to do. And I said, I need an armored car. And they said, yeah, right, where are you going to get an armored car? And, you know, the BBC by that point had an armored car. The New York Times had an armored car. Everybody had an armored car. We didn't have an armored car. And so I would like beg rides with other people. The first time I went to Sarajevo, I drove a little VW Golf. And,
well, that's helpful.
yeah, it was not great, you know. And I had I came in from Belgrade. I had Belgrade plates on the car. And you get into Sarajevo. Belgrade is where the Serbs live. And I was so naive. I stayed with a family. And it turns out that the guy I lived with had sort of hired, unbeknownst to me, people to guard my car every night, because he said, if you have a car there with Belgrade, this car is going to be destroyed. And so he had to have somebody like guard my car every night. I had no idea what I was getting into. We are so much smarter as a news organization about that now. I mean, every producer, interpreter, reporter has a helmet, has a really the proper kind of anti-ballistic armor. We have access. We had cars. We have security consultants. We have, you know, these security professionals that go out in the field with us and advise us on which roads we can take. We have medical evacuation procedures. You know, we have training how to stop a sucking chest wound. We didn't have any of that stuff. So. You know, it was a learning experience that we as a news organization had to go through. But the truth is that, I mean, you can't avoid risk. Risk is always going to be there. What I always felt is that you can protect yourself 90% of the time and get just as good a story as if you are being a kind of a daredevil. I mean, the marginal benefit of taking risks is so small that it's just not worth it. I mean, you might get a little bit, you know, in radio, you might get a little bit more of a soundtrack of bullets, you know, flying. But I found that I actually did this. I could hang my microphone outside the window of my hotel, you know, lower it down, and then go hide under the bed. Yeah. And leave it there for a couple hours, and eventually you'd get some firefight, you know, down in the streets below to reel the microphone back in, and I'd have I didn't need to be there.
I agree. Well, and Tom, I do have to wrap it up, but I did want to end on this last question, and I love this question. What island did you teach on off the coast of Maine?
Oh, I see. I taught on North Haven Island, which is in the middle of Penobscot Bay. It's offshore Rockland and Camden, and it was just a wonderful experience. It had been a pretty poor school for most of its history, and it was kind of taken over in the early 70s by a group of very idealistic young teachers who saw in that school the opportunity to sort of build an ideal school because they were free from the pressures of a centralized school administration. And they figured that as long as we work closely with the parents and give the parents what they wanted, and you know, the school board was just the parents themselves, and we'll just take responsibility for our own school. There was a decision. The principal of the school who hired me was Tony Bach, who was he's Derek Bach's cousin. Derek Bach used to be president of Harvard. He had 3 Harvard PhDs on the teaching staff of the school at the time, because there was an interesting sort of back to the land, and it was a beautiful, beautiful island, and you could go out there and you could sort of run your own school and live in this beautiful environment. And so they very expertly kind of appealed to teachers who were attracted by this idea of a small community-oriented school. And they also sought out teaching couples because they found that teaching couples were much more likely to stay there a while than single teachers. If you get a single woman out there, you know, that's pretty dreary, or a single man, so that doesn't happen. If you get a woman who's married but whose husband is not a teacher, there's nothing for him to do, and vice versa. So they found that the greatest stability that they had in teaching staff was to hire 2-by-2s. And my first wife, we were both teachers at the time, so we got actually recruited as a couple to go out there, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And it's a beautiful island, and that school is, to this day, a really exemplary school in the state of Maine, North Haven Community School.
We're going to wrap it up
Okay.
now. I want to remind everybody again, Tom will be with me tomorrow morning. We'll focus a lot more on some of the details of his new book, A Nation of Nations. But
Maybe
everybody-
then I could read a little,
Yeah.
just a little couple paragraphs.
Yes. But everyone, please sit tight for just another moment because UNH Law Dean Jordan Budd has some closing remarks, and then we'll head down to the reception. So, Dean Budd, do you want to come up, please?
So I want to thank you all again for joining us this evening at the Rudman Center for this terrific conversation. Most of you know the Rudman Center is committed in its mission to supporting the next generation of public service leaders in the law. And the center does that by providing financial support in the form of fellowships, by providing curricular and innovative experiential learning opportunities to students, but it also does it by supporting the kind of programming we just enjoyed this evening that touches on the kinds of really critical, important issues that the young people going into public service will be called to address over the course of their careers. Certainly immigration, the challenges presented by increasingly religiously diverse society are going to be at the top of that list. So it's really important to the law school in sustaining the mission of the Rudman Center that we have opportunities to bring the community together and our students for these kinds of conversations. And it wouldn't be possible, certainly this series wouldn't be possible, but for the center's collaboration with NHPR and in particular Betsy Gardella, whose tireless work is responsible for what you enjoyed this evening and for many of the other terrific opportunities for conversations that have occurred here already. So I want to thank in particular Betsy and NHPR. And I obviously want to support or thank the Couch Family Foundation, Barbara and Richard Couch, for underwriting this series. Again, without their support, we wouldn't all be enjoying the conversation we did this evening. So with that, I would invite all of you to join us downstairs in the atrium. There's going to be a reception with Tom and Laura immediately following, so exit either door, but head down the staircase to the atrium below, and we'll have a reception. So thanks again for joining us.